In May 1990, what started as a quiet spring night in Mulberry, Florida turned into a scene of fire, blood, and unthinkable violence. Inside a modest family home, 55-year-old Clarence Knowles, his wife Barbara, and their 21-year-old daughter Bonnie were brutally stabbed to death before their house was set ablaze. The attack was personal. The victims were pillars of their small community, and they were also the in-laws of David Joseph Pittman, a man locked in a bitter divorce with their daughter Marie. What followed was a chilling chain of events: a cut phone line, a stolen car later found torched, and a manhunt that would lead straight to Pittman's door. But the most unsettling part? For more than 3 decades, Pittman sat on death row claiming he was innocent, insisting that Florida was about to execute the wrong man. On September 17, 2025, after countless appeals and last-minute legal battles, David Pittman was led into the death chamber at Florida State Prison. And just before the lethal injection began, he delivered one final message that left the witnesses stunned. To understand how one of Polk County's most shocking crimes unfolded, and what Pittman said in his very last words, we have to go back to where it all began. David Joseph Pittman was born into a working-class Florida family, the kind of family where hard work wasn't optional, it was a way of life. His early years were shaped by long, humid days in small-town Florida, where everyone knew each other and reputations were made or broken at church on Sunday. Pittman grew up with a rough exterior but a quiet demeanor, a man who, by all accounts, could put in a hard day's work and rarely complained. He wasn't a man who had much handed to him, but he had the grit to make something of himself. As a young man, Pittman found employment in manual labor and construction, earning a reputation for being reliable and dedicated. Coworkers described him as the type of man who would show up before sunrise, work until the job was done, and still be willing to lend a hand to a neighbor afterward. He had calloused hands, a strong back, and a pride that came from providing for himself. But behind that work ethic was a temper, not one that flared easily but one that burned slowly and quietly until it erupted. Those close to him would later say that he held grudges, that he wasn't the type to simply forgive and forget. It was during these years that David met Marie, the woman who would later become his wife. At first, theirs was the picture of a small-town love story, a man and woman who seemed to balance each other out. Friends remember them as happy at the beginning, laughing at barbecues, dancing at local events and talking about a future together. They married and tried to build a life, but cracks soon began to form. What started as small disagreements over money, schedules and priorities turned into shouting matches behind closed doors. The once loving relationship began to unravel, and neighbors would say that Marie seemed increasingly unhappy, while David appeared more frustrated and brooding as the years went on. The marriage ultimately began to collapse under the weight of mutual resentment and betrayal. Divorce papers were filed, and what might have been a simple separation quickly became bitter and volatile. David, who had spent his life working with his hands, suddenly found himself trying to hold together a life that was falling apart at the seams. The divorce wasn't just a legal battle for him, it was personal, emotional, and consuming. Friends and acquaintances would later testify that David seemed obsessed, unable to let go of the past, and that he made alarming statements about what might happen if Marie or her family got in his way. Witnesses would recall that Pittman had allegedly made threats directed at Marie and her family, threats that hinted at something darker lurking just beneath the surface. Marie, meanwhile, had the support of her parents, Clarence and Barbara Knowles, and her younger sister Bonnie. They offered her a place to stay and emotional strength as the marriage crumbled, something that infuriated David, who began to see the Knowles family not just as in-laws but as enemies who had taken sides against him. By the spring of 1990, the situation had reached a boiling point. The divorce had not only stripped David of the life he thought he had built but had, in his mind, humiliated him and left him with nothing. Friends noticed his mood darkening, his patience growing thin. He was no longer just upset, he was angry, simmering with rage. The quiet, hard-working man from Mulberry, Florida, seemed to be spiraling, and no one knew just how far he was willing to go to take back control of his life. By the spring of 1990, the air around Mulberry, Florida felt heavy, not just with humidity but with tension. The bitter divorce between David Pittman and his wife Marie had become the talk of their small community. What had started as a private marital breakdown was now an ugly public feud. Neighbors whispered that David had been seen circling the Knowles home more than once, his truck slowing as it passed by the small house where Marie had sought refuge. Some claimed they saw him parked on nearby streets late at night, just sitting in silence. Marie, meanwhile, was trying to piece her life back together. She had turned to her parents, Clarence and Barbara, for safety and emotional support. Their home became her sanctuary, the place where she believed David couldn't reach her. But according to friends, the threats from David grew darker and more specific. Some testified that he had said things like, "They'll be sorry for what they've done to me." Clarence and Barbara Knowles were pillars of their small Mulberry neighborhood. Clarence, the father, was described as a kind but firm man, someone who believed in doing things the right way. Barbara, his wife, was the nurturing presence of the home, the one who kept family gatherings warm and welcoming. And then there was Bonnie Knowles, just 21 years old, full of life and plans for her future. Friends said she had a bright smile and a contagious laugh, the kind of young woman who made everyone feel included. To Marie, her parents and younger sister were more than just family, they were her safe harbor. They had opened their doors to her when her marriage fell apart, giving her not just a roof over her head but a sense of security and a chance to breathe. In many ways they represented everything David Pittman felt he was losing. His marriage, his family unit, his place in the world. The night of May 15, 1990, was warm and quiet in Mulberry, the kind of evening when most of the town had settled in for bed. But for David Pittman, this was the night he decided to act. Sometime after midnight, he made his way toward the Knowles residence. Court records describe what happened next in chilling detail. Pittman approached the home and cut the phone line, ensuring no one inside could call for help. Then he forced his way in. What followed was a brutal, frenzied attack. Clarence Knowles, likely woken by the noise, was the first to be attacked. He suffered multiple stab wounds, fighting for his life inside his own home. Barbara was next, stabbed repeatedly in what prosecutors later called an overkill, a sign of rage rather than necessity. And then there was Bonnie. At just 21 years old, she was no match for Pittman. The attack on her was especially savage. She was stabbed and her throat was slashed, a detail so horrific that even hardened investigators later admitted it was one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had seen. With 3 lives taken, Pittman wasn't finished. He set the house on fire, a desperate attempt to cover his tracks, to erase the evidence of what he had done. But arson can't hide everything. The fire raged, consuming the home where this family had shared birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments. Pittman then took Bonnie's car and fled the scene. But even that vehicle, a potential piece of evidence, didn't survive long. He later set the car ablaze, leaving it to burn just as he had the house. The fire would eventually be spotted by a witness, who would later become a key figure in identifying Pittman. By dawn, smoke still lingered over what was left of the Knowles home. Firefighters had worked through the night to contain the blaze, but when they stepped inside the charred ruins, they made a horrifying discovery. Beneath the blackened debris were the bodies of Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie, each bearing stab wounds, their final moments frozen in the wreckage. Autopsies later confirmed the brutality of the attack. Multiple deep stab wounds, massive blood loss, and evidence that each victim had been attacked individually. Investigators described the crime scene as one of the most grisly they had encountered in their careers. The news of the murders spread through Mulberry like wildfire. Neighbors gathered outside the property, stunned and whispering. This wasn't just a crime, this was an assault on a family everyone knew and respected. Reporters arrived, cameras rolled, and the Knowles home became a symbol of a nightmare that had ripped through the heart of a quiet Florida town. As dawn broke over Mulberry, Florida, the once quiet neighborhood was still smoldering from the inferno that consumed the Knowles family home. What firefighters initially believed was a tragic house fire quickly turned into a full-scale homicide investigation when 3 bodies were found inside: Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie Knowles, all brutally murdered before the fire was set. Investigators wasted no time piecing together the puzzle. The first and most obvious suspect was Marie's estranged husband, David Pittman. Police knew from previous domestic calls and divorce filings that Pittman had threatened Marie on multiple occasions, vowing that she and her family would pay for taking his children away. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, and soon multiple witnesses came forward reporting that they had seen Pittman's truck driving slowly past the Knowles home on the evening of May 15, 1990, just hours before the fire broke out. That same night, Bonnie's car was found abandoned and set on fire not far from the scene. An eyewitness would later testify that they saw Pittman near the burning vehicle, matching his clothing and build. Forensic teams examined the Knowles house and discovered the telephone line had been deliberately cut, a detail that showed planning and premeditation rather than a random act of violence. Perhaps most damning was the testimony that emerged from within the county jail. A fellow inmate claimed that Pittman had confessed to the murders while awaiting trial, bragging about stabbing the victims and burning the house to cover his tracks. Investigators gathered blood evidence, burn patterns, and a timeline that matched Pittman's known movements that night. Each piece of evidence began to form a chilling portrait of a calculated crime driven by anger, revenge, and a twisted sense of justice. In 1991, the case finally went before a Florida jury in one of the most closely watched trials in Polk County history. The prosecution laid out the state's case methodically, presenting crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and emotional testimony from neighbors and family members. Prosecutors described the crime as nothing short of a massacre. Clarence and Bonnie Knowles, both elderly and defenseless, stabbed multiple times in what the medical examiner called a frenzied attack. Bonnie, just 21 years old, suffered some of the most horrific injuries, including a deep slash across her throat. The courtroom fell silent as jurors were shown diagrams of the wounds and heard how the house was set ablaze while the victims lay inside, turning the entire crime scene into a fiery grave. The defense attempted to argue that Pittman had been drinking that night and had no recollection of committing the murders, suggesting that someone else could have been responsible. But the combination of eyewitness testimony, the jailhouse confession, and the physical evidence proved too strong. In a dramatic moment, prosecutors displayed a timeline graphic showing Pittman's movements from the Knowles house to the burning car, matching the witness sightings almost to the minute. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous recommendation: David Pittman should face the death penalty. When the judge pronounced the sentence, death by lethal injection, plus additional years for arson and grand theft, the courtroom was tense. Some members of the Knowles family wept quietly, others expressed relief that justice was finally being served. Pittman, stone-faced, showed little emotion as the verdict was read, staring straight ahead as if detached from the gravity of what had just happened. Following his conviction, David Pittman was transferred to Florida State Prison and placed on death row, where he would spend more than 3 decades fighting for his life through the lengthy appeals process. His defense team mounted an aggressive effort to overturn the sentence, arguing that Pittman suffered from intellectual disability and had a significantly low IQ, which should make him ineligible for execution under U.S. Supreme Court rulings such as Atkins v. Virginia. They presented psychological evaluations, childhood records, and expert testimony suggesting that Pittman endured years of abuse and neglect as a child, leaving him with brain damage and impaired judgment. His attorneys painted a picture of a man whose violent actions were rooted in untreated mental health conditions and a lifetime of trauma rather than cold, calculated evil. Despite these arguments, prosecutors countered with evidence from the original trial, emphasizing the deliberate steps Pittman took on the night of the murders: cutting the phone lines, arming himself with a knife, and setting the house ablaze, all of which pointed to premeditation and planning rather than diminished capacity. Florida's appellate courts consistently rejected his appeals, ruling that the aggravating factors of the crime far outweighed any mitigating circumstances. Pittman's legal battle made its way through state and federal courts, each time resulting in the same outcome: his conviction and death sentence would stand. As Pittman's final execution date loomed closer, his lawyers filed a last-minute request for a stay of execution with the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that new neurological evidence warranted a re-evaluation. But just hours before the scheduled execution, the High Court declined to intervene. The decision was the last legal roadblock removed, and Pittman's fate was sealed. Pittman's case sparked heated debate across Florida and beyond, reigniting the long-standing controversy over the death penalty. Some saw the execution as justice finally delivered after decades of waiting, while others viewed it as a morally troubling act, especially given the defense's claims of mental impairment. Victims' family members expressed mixed emotions. Some felt closure knowing that the man who destroyed their family would never harm anyone again, while others admitted that no execution could truly heal the wound left behind by the murders. Legal experts and journalists weighed in on television panels and in op-eds, questioning whether Pittman's mental state should have spared him from execution and whether the death penalty serves as a deterrent or merely perpetuates cycles of violence. Activists from both sides of the debate held vigils outside the prison on the night of the execution, some holding candles in memory of the victims, others protesting against capital punishment as a whole. These voices created a powerful, emotional backdrop to the final chapter of Pittman's life, reminding viewers that every execution is not just a legal event but a moral reckoning for society. On the morning of September 17, 2025, David Joseph Pittman awoke inside Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida, the state's highest security facility and the site of its execution chamber. The dawn felt heavy with inevitability. After more than 30 years on death row, this was to be his final day. Guards followed strict protocol, beginning with early cell checks and final confirmations. Later that morning, Pittman was moved from his regular death row cell to the death watch cell, a stark room located just steps away from the execution chamber. Throughout the day he was offered time for prayer and reflection. A prison chaplain visited him, offering scripture readings and last rites should he choose them. Attorneys were permitted a final meeting, where Pittman spoke with his legal team one last time about his case and his continuing claims of innocence. The warden formally read the death warrant to Pittman, a legal requirement, informing him of the time and method by which the state intended to carry out his sentence. Guards maintained a constant presence, rotating shifts, ensuring everything ran according to procedure. Outside the prison, a small crowd gathered, some family members of the victims there to witness justice, some death penalty opponents holding signs and candles in vigil. The atmosphere was tense, reflective, and solemn, as everyone prepared for the irreversible moment that would come that evening. Later in the afternoon, Pittman was offered his last meal, a long-standing tradition in capital punishment cases. Reports confirmed that he requested a spread of Southern comfort food, steak, fried chicken, biscuits, chocolate, and soda, a simple yet hearty choice for a man hours away from death. He was also allowed one final visit with an approved guest, a moment filled with quiet conversation and emotion as time slipped closer to the evening hour. As the scheduled execution time approached, Pittman was escorted from the death watch cell to the brightly lit execution chamber. Witnesses were seated behind the glass partition as prison staff secured him to the gurney with leather straps across his chest, arms, and legs. The atmosphere in the room was still, with only the soft hum of air circulation breaking the silence. When all was ready, the warden asked Pittman if he wished to make a final statement. Speaking clearly and firmly, he delivered his last words. "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody. That's it." With those words, the execution proceeded. The first drug, a sedative, was administered, followed by the paralytic, and finally the potassium chloride that would stop his heart. Pittman lay motionless as witnesses watched quietly, some with tears, others with relief. At 6:12 p.m., the attending physician pronounced him dead. The warden announced the time of death, and the curtains were drawn, marking the end of one of Florida's most drawn-out death penalty cases. David Pittman's story leaves us with haunting questions about crime, punishment, and justice. What do you think? Was this true justice served, or does this case raise doubts that can never be answered? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you were moved by this story, please like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe so you never miss a deep dive into real cases like this one. Hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when the next story drops. We bring you gripping, in-depth true crime every week.